From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible for Change. It's a very exciting program we're going to have tonight. We call it Change and Challenge. And this program is about the first administration, the first term of Governor Thomas Judge. Tom Judge was the youngest governor elected in the history of the state of Montana. He came in at a critically important time with the opportunity to make all kinds of progressive changes following the single-term administration of Forrest Anderson. It was a marvelous experience being part of that, and in the sense of full disclosure, I was part of this administration starting in 1974, but had long been a friend of Governor Judge prior to that, and all of our three participants in our marvelous panel tonight are longtime friends, so we're having basically a nice conversation about some things in our past that we're very fond of because of what it meant to us and what it meant to the state of Montana. So we have three practitioners of the trade of government and politics here who are make a superb panel. First, I want to mention Kent Kleinkopf. Kent, originally started with Governor Schwinden when he was in the Lands Department. You were at the Lands Department helping to implement the early stages of executive reorganization. Then you went, as we disclosed in a previous program, with Governor Judge in his campaign, and were extensively involved as a campaign volunteer. But then you entered the administration, at which time you became the first citizen advocate of the state of Montana. Later, and that was a unique position we're going to talk about and what happened with that. Later you headed up the Department of Business Regulation, and the last 30 years or so you've been in the private sector in a firm involved with vocational rehabilitation and vocational rehabilitation consulting.
Correct.
And I do think these folks bring a lot to the table. Sid Armstrong. Sid was on a previous program. Sid was from Helena, longtime friend since high school of Governor Judge, secretary of all of his campaigns, but also became an aide to the First Lady of Montana, Carol Judge, and ultimately ended up in the administration of Tom Judge. Later with the Montana AFL-CIO, the Democratic Party, the Montana Community Foundation, and now you're involved in philanthropic consulting. And
the Greater Montana Foundation.
And the Greater Montana Foundation, by the way, which is a sponsor of this program. She brings a wonderful experience to the table as well, and we're happy to have you here. And Norm Grosfield. Norm's from Lincoln, Montana originally, although he's been in Helena an awful long time now. Graduated from MSU, the University of Montana Law School. Came to Helena to be part of the executive reorganization implementation. After the passage of the bill in 1971, Norm was in the first stages of the implementation of executive reorganization. Later became a direct participant in the Judge administration as the first assistant administrator and then ultimately heading up the Workers' Compensation Division. 1973 as an assistant, as the head of that in 1975 until 79. And for the last 35 years, you've been practicing law in Helena, but you are one of the more active and keen observers of politics and government in Montana, and so we're happy to have you on board as well. It's a great panel. These folks have such terrific experience, and I mentioned when we were talking about the challenge and change issue, when we left our last program about Tom Judge, we were wrapping it up, and Sid, you mentioned, as you were at the mansion, the first night Governor Judge and Carol Judge and all the friends who helped him move were at the mansion, something that he said about his aspirations as governor. Could you go repeat that again for us as a starting point?
I would be delighted to, Evan. We had spent the whole day moving. A friend who worked for one of the moving companies got a truck. There was no paid moving. There was no money. Tom had a sole business, and when he wasn't working, there wasn't much money coming in. That night we were down in the lower level of the governor's mansion. Carol's family had brought in fried chicken and some beer and so forth. And as we were relaxing and talking and so on, Tom said to me, you know, I want to be the kind of governor that Lee Metcalf is as a senator. I want to do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because it's going to get me votes. And I think that set the tone of what he wanted to do with his administration.
Well, I think it did, and I really appreciate you repeating that. Now I'm going to read a couple direct quotes from Tom that are very salient to us approaching this this job today to try to describe such a diverse and active term that he had. When he announced for governor in October of 1971, this is what Governor Judge said, candidate Judge at that time, Lieutenant Governor Judge. He said, "My candidacy is founded on the belief that government can do a better job. We can improve the organization and management of government. We can protect the environment, serve the needs of the people. We can inspire the confidence of Montanans. We can initiate progressive new policies to assure people receive a fair return for their tax investment." And then a little over a year later, when the campaign was over and he had won, on his inauguration, he said the following: "They," meaning Montanans, "want a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. They want to preserve the wholesome quality of life we enjoy in Montana. They want opportunities for their children. They want honest, efficient government, and they want a government that cares about people." And then he quoted John F. Kennedy, said, John F. Kennedy said this, "I do not shrink from that responsibility. I welcome it." And he said that's the way he wanted to approach his administration. So I think we can see by his words that Tom Judge wanted to make a big difference. And he came on the heels of the single term of Forrest Anderson. And Forrest really set the stage for this progressive period by what he did on a lot of fronts, one of which was the executive reorganization. I want to ask you about that in a second, but I want to ask you to make a point that you made to me the other day about the nature of maybe a little contrast between Forrest Anderson's 4 years and what was would happen once Tom Judge got rocking and rolling as governor.
Yes, Evan, Forrest had been involved in every aspect of state government. He'd been a legislator, he'd been a Supreme Court justice, he had been Attorney General, and now he's governor. So he had an absolute wealth of experience. He knew state government inside and out. And starting with that, his primary focus was inward, in making state government work better for the people. I think that...
And I think it's worth noting that the import of that is that when you have a government, an executive branch that doesn't function well, that it simply empowers the powerful who already know how to get their way, the people that ran this state for the first 75 years that before we had to have this crucible of change.
Well, you had 170 odd boards, commissions, bureaus, departments, you name it, scattered all over the state with little or no accountability to a single executive.
So in a way, you're saying he was pointed inward to make government really work for people.
Right.
How did that contrast with Governor Judge?
Well, Governor Judge had the responsibility of continuing to implement this sweeping change in state government, this executive reorganization, bringing departments together, because they were only allowed 20 departments, you've got to remember. So the scope of the change was monumental. For the first time, department directors were answerable to the governor and had to serve at the pleasure of the governor. So they could be fired for any time, any reason.
But was he then focused on the internals of the government completely, or was it?
Well, I wouldn't say completely, but the difference that I noticed was that judges' two administrations were much more focused on outreach, bringing back to Montana anything that sounded like a good idea. Wheat to Taiwan, beef to Japan, you name it. So
and the implementation of the Constitution, which meant empowering, reaching out to the people of Montana as well.
Well, that was one of the biggest changes of all, of course. The focus from the corporations virtually running the state of Montana, which they had since its inception, to the people now becoming empowered.
And I think that's an interesting observation. When you first told me that, I thought, that's really interesting. Kind of an inward focus, not totally by Forrest, but really an inward focus as opposed to beyond the implementation of that, this outward focus for Tom Judge, which seemed to fit him as a person, by the way.
Absolutely.
His nature was to be reaching out there with people the way
very outgoing.
Now, Norm, I want to ask you, we're on this subject, initial subject of the transfer, the change from the two administrations, and the reorganization, that's where you came to work. Your job was to help implement this massive change that was statutorily adopted in early '71. You came on in the fall of '71 with the idea that now somebody's going to have to make this work. Tell us a little bit about that and then how the governor interfaced with that.
Yes, Evan, thank you. Well, I graduated from law school in 1971, and of course everybody that graduates from law school is looking for a job. And Duke Crowley was a professor, well-known professor of law in Montana and well-known throughout the state of Montana. And he and a friend of mine named Ted Doney, who had a lot to do with the executive reorganization, asked me if I would consider coming to Helena as the first job. So I looked at it, and after looking at it and after talking to Professor Crowley and then George Bosselman, who was another well-known figure in state government at that time, I agreed to do that. And it was a massive job. We had about 6 people in the office at that time, but we had to proceed to implement each of the 20 departments one by one. We had to find the director, we had to find the administrators, and then we had, and they came in sequence. They all didn't start at one time. It took a period of time. So we worked with each department as it was developed and as it was brought on. We worked with the director, and finally we got all the departments implemented.
And initially, you're working with Governor Anderson to get this done.
Working with Governor Anderson.
For about a year, a little over a year.
Yes. But Tom was also involved in the process even before he was elected. Mm-hmm. And of course, when he was elected, that's when the implementation really started, and so we proceeded to do that. And it was not only a job to try to implement each department and get it going and bring in all these diverse interest groups that became one department, to try to coordinate them and get their confidence. We also had to go through hundreds of pages of law to coordinate the law so it fit within the state code structure. And that was also a massive job. And we had to do it. We had to be very careful that we didn't add or subtract from the law, but that we implemented it. And we had to go through a number of bills in legislature. We had these bills that were literally hundreds of pages long to
You ended up
coordinate
bringing
that.
a whole bunch of bills forward to the 73 session to implement what the 71 session had passed.
Exactly.
And in that case, you were bridging from Forrest Anderson to Tom Judge,
That's correct.
who ultimately named the directors of all these departments. By that time, they were pretty much all formed by the 73 session.
They were.
Yeah, and that was an interesting thing. But were there any quirky things about that, or things that stood out? Board of Investment. There were some things were absolutely gotten rid of. I think that the workers' comp was changed. The Board of Investments was a new thing that made a big difference. Tell us a couple of things that jumped to the forefront.
You know, before executive reorganization, the banks of Montana would hold money for various different departments there was no interest that was provided to the state from these deposits. The state didn't even know where all the money was. So Forrest Anderson and then Tom Judge saw to it that they developed one entity called the Board of Investments, which is a board that is appointed with public involved, and the board now, since 1972, has had the responsibility to invest all of the funds of the state of Montana in one area.
I think they now have under their control the investment of $13 billion.
Yeah, and the history since 1972 of the type of investment and the income that this has provided the state of Montana is phenomenal.
It's really made a difference, and it's hard to look at that and say that the allocation of all that money out to banks was political favoritism or if it was any scandalous or anything else, but it certainly was the way of the world back then, but it certainly wouldn't pass scrutiny today. So having a single place to do this where it was a monumental change.
Monumental change, and also it just has provided a very significant amount of money for each budget that is created since 1972.
And I know Governor Judge was extraordinarily proud of the people he appointed to that board, that they helped to implement it, and because Forrest barely got it started before he was gone. But it was a great, wonderful idea. Now, in terms of, let me ask you, Kent, a question here, because we talked about the governor and his statements about wanting to have government reach out to the people. You ended up being the single person who epitomized that probably more than anyone in the initial stages of the administration because of this so-called citizens advocate position. Now, there was a term called ombudsman that was floating around a lot at that time. That wasn't used, but the advocate position was used. It didn't exist before. Tell us about Tom's commitment to that, how it happened, and what it meant.
Evan, Tom had talked a lot about this idea in the 72 campaign. It was one of the things that he hoped to implement. When the legislature came into session, we found out that Max Baucus, who was a representative at that time, had his own idea about how government should be approached. He called his office a legislative ombudsman. So we had some interesting discussions with Max in those days about...
Well, not atypical of a thing. Legislators tended to think everything ought to center on the legislative branch, but the truth be told, access to the executive branch is kind of an executive branch function.
It is, and as a matter of fact, because the office was located within the governor's office, that's what gave you the leverage and the authority to actually address people's concerns about various agencies.
So you went to the legislature with a budget. It was really a budgetary item more than anything else.
It was.
That said, we're going to budget for a citizen's advocate. And lo and behold, when you finally prevailed in the legislature, you were named?
Well, for whatever reason, Max decided that it might be a better idea to have it in the governor's office. So he relented, and it did get put into the budget. It did get passed.
Well, you know,
and
when
it's,
you're
and
a
it's
senior,
still in existence to this day, by the way. I'd like to point out.
when you're a senior U.S. senator, you might have a difference with the governor, want to argue about it. When you're a first-term legislator and the governor says, "This is what I want," sometimes the discretion is a better part of valor here.
Maybe that came into play.
He went with it, and you became the citizen advocate.
The first one.
And your assistant was a long-term citizen advocate after you left. It was part of
Kathy McGowan.
It was Kathy
Schillinger
then,
in those days.
and then Kathy McGowan.
Right.
And the two of you set up a phone line, which the number of which is still the same, isn't it?
It is.
1-800.
332-2272.
I could almost say it
Picked
too.
from a list.
And if people had a problem with state government, you were there to be their advocate? Was that the idea?
Correct.
You had a lot of calls.
Initially, we had a tremendous number of calls. Once in a while, you'd run into a person that had a problem with an agency, and the agency had done everything imaginable to help solve the problem, and it wasn't solvable. So we did have some of those kinds of calls.
Often you shook it loose, didn't you?
Often we had great cooperation from the agencies. I don't remember a time when we had a problem that couldn't be solved one way or another.
You know, and so, rhetorically saying we want people to be able to have access to and make government work for them, but the tools of implementing that was, in many cases, right through you on a micro level of individual citizens who couldn't seem to negotiate the bureaucracy, could get some help.
That's correct.
And
my my good friend John Malia is the current citizens advocate, and the office has been in existence ever since 1973.
so here we are, 42 years later. It's still in existence. It was an idea worth not only starting but keeping. There you go. I mean, I think that stands the test of time. And over the years, I think that, it's hard to tell the untold thousands upon thousands of Montanans who, thanks to that vision of Tom Judge, have had government work better for them, which is what he was talking about,
Exactly.
I think. Now, we had another interesting thing that happened in the transition from Forrest Anderson to Tom Judge. Because the normal thing that happens when administrations change is there's a wholesale removal of the existing department directors and personal staff of the governor and anybody the governor had appointees, and there are plenty of people lined up who helped with the campaign or friends of the governor or just people that knew him and he had expertise that were saying, hey, I'm here and available to help put your stamp on government. Tom Judge's administration had almost an unprecedented level of continuity from the previous administration. Forrest Anderson's department directors, he looked at that and said, I like a lot of these people. Tell us how you were part of the selection process as an aide to the governor at that time. Tell us how that played out and what the thinking was.
Well, Evan, you've got to remember Tom Judge was lieutenant governor at that time, had been for 4 years. He was extremely familiar, having been a legislator in both houses, having been elected lieutenant governor. He was extremely familiar with personnel and the workings of government. So he knew an awful lot of these people already personally and had dealt with them. So it was a fairly easy transition with some of these top-notch players, people like Ron Richards, that's an example, the consummate government official and political strategist. Gosh, I could go down the list, but I won't. But Tom's familiarity with all of these people helped a great deal.
I think far and away better than half the department directors were retained.
They were.
Because Tom knew them and they were doing the job, and he said, okay, let's keep doing this job. I've got no problem here. So that continuity served him well. Often incoming governors have a slow start, but he had a team that was on the ground and ready to run with him, didn't he?
Remember, we were still in the process of reforming state government. So it was important, I believe, to keep a lot of those personalities doing the job that they were doing pretty well.
And then you brought some new folks in too. But Sid, there were a lot of new people that came in at the same time. When you have the youngest governor in the history of the state of Montana.
Evan, you keep saying in the state of Montana, he was the youngest governor in the history of the country.
Oh, is that right?
At
Oh
the
yeah,
time.
seriously.
Wow.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so many of the people he brought in, it was a wonderful balance. You had the good sort of veterans that had been with Forrest Anderson, and whom, as Kent points out, Tom knew and trusted and so forth. But he also brought in a whole lot of younger people. People so young in their 20s that outsiders thought it was, just a bunch of kids playing around. Didn't happen to be true. But there was a great dynamic and excitement, energy, inspired by Tom. And people who wanted, as you have, both you and Kent, Norm have pointed out so well, he wanted to do something good. He wanted to open government. He wanted to make it work for people. These were younger people who were absolutely dedicated to this. And it was a change that was starting to go on in the country, but it was very unusual at the time. Usually it was all male, it was older men, and it was men with experience in, say, law and business and so on. These were very much young, energetic people with a lot of brains, a lot of talent, not a whole lot of experience. But when they got together, and with that good balance, we were able to make some really wonderful things happen. Again, for the people.
A lot of idealism
Very
was
much
involved
so.
in those days, Evan.
Very much so.
Well, that's interesting because you sometimes see so much cynicism today. It's hard to think of an idealistic time.
Believe it or not, government was a whole lot of fun to be in
Look, it was so
in
much
those
fun.
years.
Yeah.
A whole lot.
Well, in terms of the age thing, I mean, it's an interesting observation that I had been with Forrest Anderson and then went down to the Democratic Party. When I came back up to the governor's office under Governor Judge in March of 1974, about 15 months into his administration, I was a seasoned veteran of
Yes,
29
exactly.
at that time.
Exactly.
I was 29. In fact, I wasn't quite 29. And so there was a whole cadre of youthful people, but we were all intermixing and learning from the more seasoned folks. It was an interesting
Exactly.
chemistry, almost like the leavening of bread that was occurring in that process. I thought it was an exciting time in my life.
Oh, I think it was in all of ours. I think the other thing I would point out is that we became such good and close-knit personal friends as well as professional friends. I mean, we celebrated weddings and births and baptisms and funerals and had wonderful times together, many of them connected with events at the mansion.
And we still do.
And we still, I was going to say, and these are lifelong friends. And if you remember, we used to gather quite frequently on a Friday evening at either the pub or at Ichabod's, a downtown watering hole, as the saying goes. And we called ourselves the hacks and the crats, the political hacks and the bureaucrats. We got together for fun, but we also came up with some very good and innovative ways to continue to make life and government better. And I think it also smoothed the way for department directors and staff to work more easily together. There was a trust factor there and a respect. We had a really good time doing all this.
Can I point out that Evan and Norm and I were the crats? We weren't the hacks, okay?
I was the hat. What do you mean
Well,
we're the
now I
hacks?
don't know about that.
Anyway, it was a joking kind of term.
I often introduce myself as an old political hack.
There you go.
You know, so which I speak of as an honorable profession.
Well, I do too.
Yes.
An
I do
honorable
too.
profession. You
kindest
know, there's a great internalizing that occurs in government because when you all start working together, there was a team effort there.
Yes.
And it's hard to express that, and how much teamwork and the sense of mission. But again, the
Sense of
mission really was not about what was going on in Helena, but how what was going on in Helena affected the citizens of Montana, economically, sociologically. So citizen participation was a real hallmark.
I want to circle back, if I may, for just a moment, Evan, to add that Tom and Carol were also friends of all of ours.
Yes.
And we socialized and enjoyed each other and so forth and so on. And just a little quick anecdote, we were at a governor's conference in Washington, D.C. Jerry Brown was governor at the time. He just keeps popping back up. But we were seated at breakfast at a table at the hotel, and he and his staff were seated next to us. Later on, one of his staff came up to me and said, I can't believe how much you all enjoy each other and how much your governor enjoys you. And you talk back and forth and you joke and you seem to have such a good friendship and a good time. He said, you know, our governor isn't a bit like that.
Well, you know what we always say about Montana. It's a small town with really long streets. We all know each other. There is a kind of a thing about Montanans being real with each other. You know, as we went forward in terms of impacting people, one of the ways and one of the groups of people, if you will, that had to have some positive impacts, needed them, were the workers of Montana. The workers, the blue collar and white collar workers of Montana, who had, I don't want to say suffered through, but had managed to survive those 75 years when we were a corporate colony of the Anaconda Company, and now we're looking to state government to provide them better access, better services. Norm, can you speak to some of the things the Judge administration did related to workers, the wide range of things that related to workers, which was a big constituency?
Yes, in the workers' compensation area, there had been a federal study about the problems of workers' compensation throughout the United States. Forrest Anderson and Tom Judge looked at that and said, we need to do something in Montana. And so actually they brought labor and management, Chamber of Commerce people to an advisory council, and they developed a set of legislation to really update the workers' compensation system in the state of Montana. And the federal government had 14 essential recommendations, and the state of Montana adopted in the '73 session almost every one of those, way ahead of all the other states, and really updated the protection for injured workers in this state. It was progressive legislation, and it was really needed. And then I worked on...
Wasn't it through that the adjudication went to a judge?
We created the workers' compensation judge. There were problems in the system before that. There were conflicts of interest. There were, at that time, 28 district court judges that had 28 different opinions as to how to apply the Workers' Compensation Act. We wanted one court with one judge, and that system has worked very well. It's now supported, and it's supported by both the labor industry and management, and it's been, and the whole system is, I mean, there has been problems in workers' compensation regarding costs, but every state faces that. But the system in Montana really is quite good. And then there, before 1973, public employees in the state really didn't have the authority to collectively bargain in the state. And so I worked on legislation creating the Public Employees Collective Bargaining Act. And after that was passed, all public employees, including local government employees, had the law behind them to properly negotiate contracts. I think that was a progressive effort. There were efforts in improving the minimum wage in the state of Montana and updating the unemployment compensation law as well. So there was quite an effort to really improve the laboring folks and their work in this state, and Tom really pushed that, and it got through. And I must say that back in those days, labor and management actually would get together even before the session and work things out. And we would come to the session, and oftentimes these things were already worked out by the various groups. And the legislature thought that was great because they didn't have to deal with, you know, these hearings with divergent views. And things really worked out well. And Tom had a great, he was a former senator in the state of Montana. Mm-hmm. And he developed a lot of friendships in the legislative process on both sides of the aisle. And he would ask us in the governor's office, and he would ask department heads to, before the session, get together and see if we can work out these issues. And of course, you can't work everything out, but you can work a lot out. And he just had a great association with both sides of the aisle, and things got done without a lot of conflict, other than, of course, you would have usual conflicts over taxes and things like that. But a lot of these other things that really affect a lot of people in the state, and they don't realize it, were worked out beforehand.
Well, workers, I think, look at that period as being a period where magnificent gains took place. Right. And some of our previous programs have discussed that. You know, one of the things I want to have us touch on is institutions, because we had touched on this briefly before, Sid, about how First Lady Carol Judge had a long-term interest in that from the time she was a student nurse. And then when Governor Judge became governor, he became fully aware of that and tried to implement a lot of changes, but they were rejected by the legislature in '74, and the day after the legislature there was a statewide strike of institutional workers, and the governor had to call out the National Guard to take care of the institutions. A lot of reforms emerged from that, but that was kind of the catalyst. Just talk a little bit about that for a second.
Well, first of all, and I think we did mention it the last time, the fact that the National Guard had to go in and take over was the best thing that could have happened, because people from throughout the state went to work in the institutions and saw the absolutely horrific conditions. And they went home and said, people can't live like this. We can't have institutions like this. Something needs to be done. So there really was interest and awareness around the state. Meanwhile, both Tom and Carol, but especially Carol, taking the lead in this. As you mentioned, as a student nurse, she had spent 3 months at Warm Springs. So she was pretty intimately knowledgeable about it. Then we went, sometimes with the governor, sometimes just the two of us. We went and visited all the institutions. We heard from the people in them what was going on. We talked to the administration and so forth and so on. And so that as the legislature and the administration began to work on deinstitutionalization, and that was happening throughout the country as well, it wasn't simply in Montana, working towards having those residents of various institutions, I speak particularly now of Boulder River School and Hospital for the developmentally disabled, who could have group homes and community services and so on. Carol was wonderful about promoting them and supporting them. And oftentimes when a group home was opening in a community where people were dubious and they didn't know how it might work, the people running the home and the people involved with the community-based services would have some sort of a tea or an open house, and they would invite Carol, who would come and be her usual warm, wonderful, gracious, welcoming self. And it really put a stamp of approval on those community-based services, as well as the sheltered workshops we would visit and so forth and so on. So she played just a tremendous role. And she played a tremendous role in an informal way. I don't think she ever testified at the legislature, but she would talk to various lobbyists and legislators about what she had seen. So she made a huge difference.
And Tom was also, and there was massive change occurred as a result of that.
Oh, no question.
And he was also really proud of the fact that about the new prison.
Oh, absolutely.
About the fact that that thing behind the walls in Deer Lodge, for those of us who've spent a night in Old Max, which I did just as a visit, it was like a dungeon. And the way that prisoners were, and then they all of a sudden they have a new prison. Now that's our old prison now, 40 years later, but that was a big deal to have that
should
prison.
say it was.
And the reform
It was
of
wonderful.
institutions involved that as well. Now, we had a lot of environmental things that happened as well, and I want to, because he spoke about that. How do we have to maintain this unique quality of life we have as Montanans? And it found its way through land use planning, water laws, and so on like that, things involving coal severance, the Environmental Policy Act, and so on, the Coal Trust Fund. So I want to have us all collectively kind of dive into that a little bit. I wonder if you might talk a little bit, Norm, about the land use planning issues, subdivision laws, things like that that happened that really kind of helped us to have development done in a better fashion.
Yes, up until the early 70s, there really wasn't much in the way of regulation of land use. And local governments were having very difficult times because parties would go out and just create a subdivision without any thought as to the roads or the sewers, water, anything like that. And Tom took a great interest in that, and we developed the Platting Act, Subdivision and Platting Act, to allow local governments to regulate and at least see to it that when a subdivision is created, that it fits in within either the city or the county area.
Now that again is one of those reforms that meant a lot because it wasn't there before. It's still with us today.
Well, and it's a very important part of local government today. You have to, you know, to operate a city or even a county, you have to have some thought as to where the roads are going, where the water's coming from, where fire departments can go, where law enforcement has access. And there are very detailed now rules to regulate those things, but that's to the benefit of everybody that lives in a city or a county.
And you speak of one of those aspects being where would the water come from. Water law advancements under the Judge administration were phenomenal too, weren't they?
Yes, and I'm going to say that I think I kind of created the water law in the state of Montana, and I'll tell you why. I have a story about that. I took water law in law school from a very well-known professor named L. Stone. And I learned in water law, in this water law course, that the water law system in the state of Montana was a real mess. And it just didn't work because it was operated by the courts, and every time somebody came in with a new water law, they had to relitigate everything, not just the old established water rights, but they had to litigate the whole new thing. So I went to Ted Doney, who was the director of the Department of Natural Resources at that time, and I said, Ted, I took this water law course and I found out that the water law system in this state is a real mess. I think you should look into that. And he did. And we found out that it was a mess. And then he took it to the governor, and they ultimately adopted the new water law in 1973, which is a permit system. And of course, it's kind of interesting because that was one of the big issues in this current legislature, and I kind of had to chuckle about that. But eventually, under a permit system, we will know in Montana what everybody's rights are, and we will be able to protect Montana law and Montana water against claims from other states. It's a massive project, but eventually it's going to be done, and it's going to be of great benefit to all of the states. So I take a little bit of pride in at least suggesting.
Well, as you know,
approach.
that old saying
for
that
you.
they say in Montana or in the West, you know, that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting.
Right.
And, you know, to try to eliminate some of that fighting was probably very worthwhile. You know, when you think about on the environmental side of it, we had a very interesting thing that when I was having a discussion with Governor Schwinden, who prior to being governor was the head of the lands department. And he said that one of his attorneys had come up with this idea. They come up with this idea about which ultimately became the Resource Indemnity Trust.
Oh, sure.
and the indemnity word was one that John Henson came up with, who was an attorney there. And John came to Ted, and they said, well, this word works pretty well. It means that we have to pay some money and build up a trust that indemnifies for the loss of all this resource. And he went to Forrest Anderson and said, Forrest said, that looks like a pretty good idea, but you better go talk to Tom about it because he's going to be governor a couple of months. So, of course, Ted must have gone to Tom and presented it, and Tom always spoke how highly about it, how he really thought that was one of the great, terrific things to start out with, was to get the Resource Indemnity Trust put into place, which itself led to, conceptually, to the Coal Tax Trust Fund. Once a coal severance tax was created, and we had that situation where the Coal Trust evolved and was put on the 1976 ballot. Can we talk a little bit about that? Anybody want to dive in? Or I think Francis Bardno was involved with that a bit, but it had to. But because it was a constitutional issue, it had to go on the ballot, and it did in 76. So it was something the governor supported in the 75 session. Am I right?
Yeah, and it was. I mean, anytime you're dealing with any natural resource issue and you're dealing with large corporations, you're going to have major issues, of course, especially when it comes to taxation. And it took quite an effort to proceed to establish that, but it ultimately did succeed, and look what it's done for the state of Montana now. And it's just been.
I think Tom was very proud of that Coal Trust Fund.
He was.
And it was Senator Tom Tao, as I recall, who was the real legislative leader at the time in it. And he recently was back at the Capitol testifying in favor of a similar trust fund involved with oil. Which is pretty amazing.
It is interesting because the depleted resources provided revenue which built up over time and then provided interest earnings forever. And right now there's $1 billion in that fund, which is funding local businesses, which is the interest is going to the general fund. Some of it's dedicated, almost $250 million of it's dedicated to interest to serve infrastructure development. It is a wonderful legacy that Tom Judge put his thumbprint on big time. And of course the people said yes. And you know, one of the things about that trust fund, as it was developed and ran through the legislature and had to have 2/3 vote with Tom's support to have it happen, is that in order to tap into it or take money out of it, it took a 3/4 vote of each house, and it's very hardly ever happened. But there have been constant efforts to change it, including even this session. And so it stood the test of time. But I think it's something he always spoke, that he was very proud of what happened. And look at that, $1 billion now and still growing. I think Tom knew how to count money.
Absolutely.
Being a businessman, Democrat, he knew how to count money.
Well, he knew how to count votes too.
Good point.
And believe me, the citizens of Montana are in favor of maintaining this trust and not breaking it.
Well, when they put the 3/4 vote requirement in, it was not to protect the trust from the people. It was to protect the trust from the Helena politicians in the legislature who were looking for some easy money that they could go spend on something. So that's been protected, and it's sacrosanct, and I think that's a very interesting thing that happens. It had a lot of foresight. I want to talk a little bit about taxes, because we talked about the coal severance tax that came in, and Tom was very proud of that. That led to the Coal Trust Fund. The homestead tax relief, he wanted to put some homeowner tax relief in, and he couldn't get the legislature to agree with him. So what did Tom do?
Well, he took it to the people, and the people agreed with him.
He did it by initiative, right?
By initiative. Overwhelmingly agreed with him. Tom was very, very proud of the fact that he was able to get property tax relief passed, and it was no small feat. But he was equally proud of the fact that taxes were not raised at all during those years in order to facilitate this relief. So I think the figure that he always quoted was it sticks in my mind, $243 million in property tax relief that he was able to gain through this.
Well, what happened was it became an initiative. They had to get signatures,
Oh, I
put it
remember
on the
getting those
ballot.
signatures, yes.
And then when it was voted on, by the way, 71% of the people supported
Correct.
it. That being said, Tom, who knew how to count, did not make it permanent relief because you never knew what was going to come around the corner. And so he made it a one-time relief to see what this budget cycle is going to be the next time and the next time, because you're obligated to balance a budget if you're the governor. So he managed to get that done. I wanted to, and we have limited time remaining, but I wanted to chat a little bit about the fact that we have, during the first Judge administration, we had the one and only cycle where we had annual legislative sessions. When Tom came in 1973, the legislature met, and they were going to meet because of the new Constitution in 73 and 74, and then the normal off year 75. So for 3 straight years, Tom Judge had a legislature to deal with, an co-equal branch of government. Your thoughts, all of you, for having to deal with the legislature for 3 straight years?
Well, I think it's interesting that Sid brought this up earlier. I think she should repeat what Tom ended up saying after
Well, a couple of
going through 3 legislative sessions
Well, a couple of things.
back to back to back.
First of all, I think the reason people said, no, this isn't working, we're voting this out, was because there was at least the perception that the bills that had failed in the first part of that particular legislature, in that following year, in the next session, they just brought them all back up again, fought the same fights, et cetera, et cetera. And so that it was a big waste of time and a big waste of money. And of course, Tom, trying to deal with the administration and the implementation of executive reorg, the new Constitution, new ideas, having to deal all the time with the legislature wasn't really very easy. And one day he said, it's funny, when I was a legislator, I thought annual sessions were the best idea anybody could have ever had. I was all for them. Now I think I wish they'd meet maybe once every 50 years.
That reminds me of Governor Schweitzer, who said instead of 90 days every 2 years, it should be 2 days every 90 years. That being said, the co-equal branch of government is very important, and the balance
totally,
and everything,
of
and we all
course.
understand that. Now I want to very quickly touch on public forums, outreach. Governor Judge made a point of going to all 56 counties and bringing the principles of government right out there to meet in the city halls and the town halls all across Montana until he'd been to all 56 in the first 4 years. Isn't that's the way it happened, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely.
We did end up going to all 56 counties. We would meet with local governmental officials during the afternoon. Then in the evening, we'd invite the public in, and for several hours, the public had every opportunity to ask any question that came to mind. And we would take department directors, anybody that was involved and could be helpful in facilitating
For that particular area, even.
for that particular area. They were invited along. Later on, we pared that down and only.
But that was a hallmark of his administration.
It
You talk
was.
about
Opening it up.
outward and looking outward and
that
everything
outreach
else.
we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Now, I want to quickly touch on women's issues because the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, had been adopted by the Montana legislature in terms of us ratifying the federal amendment. But it was during the Judge administration when the forces from the right, who were against women's equal rights, came in and tried every session to have it rescinded by the legislature. It became a Donnybrook. But Tom always stood tall in favor of the ERA, as I recall, and was a very strong advocate for women's rights across the board.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
No question about that, as was Carol.
Yeah. And so,
As evidenced by the fact of bringing in all kinds of women into his administration over time.
Yes, clearly.
yeah, he did name
First
a lot.
women department directors,
yeah.
first women that were something more than secretaries, as I recall. Maybe Forrest had 1 or 2, but Tom made that a real hallmark. He also, and this is in the next 4 years, we won't talk about it right now, another big effort, though, was appointing more women to boards, commissions, and advisory councils. Once again, except for, let's say, the Board of Cosmetologists, those boards were all composed of men, and there was no thought that it might be a good idea to have a woman occasionally.
Now we're going to kind of start to wrap up here. There's so much to cover because it was such a monumental administration following Forrest Anderson and implementing and then reaching out and doing more. Kent, you had talked about some salient words from a couple of prominent Montana historians that you thought reflected the period.
President Mike Malone, the Montana State University
Who was a prominent historian of Montana.
who was a preeminent Montana historian, indicated that during the decade of the 70s, there were more changes made than at any time in Montana's history. Another very, very well-known and important historian, Dave Walter, in Montana Century, Shaping the Future, said that Montana abruptly emerged as a national leader in environmental stewardship, consumer protection, and participating democracy. This political, social, and economic revitalization made an extraordinary transformation for a state historically dependent on extractive industries, transcontinental railroads, a captive press, and the what were called the Montana Twins, the Anaconda Company and the Montana Power Company.
And what we're talking about with Governor Judge is the continued total removal of the copper collar from Montana.
Yes.
That's what this is really, really all about.
It is.
Sid, your personal reflections on helping out with this first administration.
I think it was one of the most inspiring times, not only in the state's life, but I would venture to say all of us and the people who worked on it for that positive change and that sense that we really were making a difference. Things really were better for working families, for the environment, for education, for schools, for natural resources. All of these things, we were making real progress. We knew we hadn't gotten to the epitome of it, but we wanted to keep moving forward. And Governor Judge was so much a leader and an inspiration to all of us, as well as a friend, along with Carol.
You know, remember the kind of subtitle of this series is moving from a corporate colony to a citizen state. So your reflections on being part of that, Norm?
Well, Sid referred earlier to the group as not necessarily being kids, but I think I was a kid and I had a lot to learn. But I share with Sid and Kent about how fun it was to be involved in it, to be involved in these new initiatives, and to develop the friendships that carry on today. But, you know, the structure of state government in Montana is the envy of an awful lot of states. It is probably about the best structure that any government can have. There are a lot of states that still, where the governor has very little power, and Montana has this great structure, and it carries on today for the benefit of everybody.
Well,
they look to our new Constitution, especially in
and
that
we
regard.
put so much time of this series into that Constitution because of what it meant. These were exciting and dynamic times. We were all blessed to have the opportunity, I think, to participate in them and make a difference. And those changes in Montana are important to know how they happened, and that's one of the reasons we have this series in the Crucible of Change. So we look forward to seeing you in the next edition.